Well, Rama is quite an extraordinary character. He's served as a kind of cultural ideal and model for countless people across southern Asia, as a kind of exemplar of how a person should behave in this world. When Sita is abducted, Rama becomes violently agitated, and he threatens to actually destroy the world. You know, there's a character in the Ramayana who's actually more dangerous than Ravana. When we were children, we always wanted to hear stories from Mahabharata. Parents would say, no, you should read the Ramayana, because the Ramayana is what makes you a good person.
What compelled you to take up such an enormous and daunting project?
I don't know about a natural connection to the subject. I became interested in India when I was in college. I was actually a science major, but I had an opportunity when I was an undergraduate to take a course in what they called in those days Oriental Civilizations, which was a full-year course looking at the cultural history of India, China, and Japan. And we had almost no education about non-Western cultures in my earlier schooling. That's unfortunately a problem in the West and continues to be a problem in many ways. But I just became very fascinated with the India material. It was something completely new to me. And so when I asked my professors, what could I do to expand my knowledge, they said, well, why don't you I was at a place that was Columbia University, where you had a lot of options. And they said, you should take a course in Indian history and Indian art and so on. I started to take those courses. And then they said, if you really want to learn something about the culture of India, you should take Sanskrit. So I said, okay, let's do that. And so I started to take Sanskrit, and I became extremely entranced, you could say, by the language and the culture that had produced it. And I decided to change my plans for the future and to go to graduate school in Sanskrit studies. So I don't know if that's a natural or unnatural connection, but, you know, people study things that are both in and outside of their own sort of natural, if you like, you mean by being born in a culture, traditions. And I think it's good to get a little bit outside of your own. You get a better perspective on your own culture and on cultures of various places in the world. And I then went to India, and I was doing a PhD on the Mahabharata, actually, and working with Pandits, learning to speak Sanskrit, recite Sanskrit, and so on. And this was in Pune, or what they called Pune back in those days. And I went with a friend of mine who was also studying Sanskrit in this hot season. We went up into the hills of Mahabaleshwar, and I happened to take with me the Gujarati printing press edition of the Ramayana, which is the one with the 3 popular commentaries of many, many commentaries. And in the evenings, you know, there was no TV, there was no movies, there was nothing to do there. We were essentially in the jungle, and we would read the Ramayana aloud and discuss it. And we became fascinated with it. And I began to think, this is actually an extraordinary text. It's actually one of the great texts of humanity, not to say only India, because it has an enormous cultural footprint across all of Southern Asia, in every language, every culture, every nation, every religion, actually, of Southern Asia and on into Central Asia, and then again around the world through the South Asian and Southeast Asian diaspora. And it's very little known in Western countries. And I said, this is a great loss, because, you know, they're still, you know, going on about the Iliad and the Odyssey, which are great texts, but they're texts of dead civilizations, frankly. Now, it just so happened that a few years prior to that, this period I'm talking about, and I will talk a little bit more about that perhaps, is that the scholars at the Oriental Institute of Baroda in Gujarat had completed a massive critical edition of the Valmiki Ramayana, the first such edition and only such edition to date. And this edition gives us insight into a little bit of the past of the Ramayana, because I don't know how many of your audience understands what a critical edition does, and we can talk about that as well. But it does not give you the original Ramayana. That text is lost to us. If there ever was a single original text, it's thousands of years in the past, and we do not have it. The Valmiki Ramayana, which is what we're talking about here, is, I believe, the oldest text and the direct or indirect source of all the hundreds of Ramayanas or thousands of Ramayanas. It's hard to count them. that have become popular in literature and film and performance and television and sculpture and drama. I mean, it's an extraordinary cultural gift to humanity. But people think that it may be just one text, but it's not, because over the course of its existence, being told orally, recited and performed and written down in countless manuscripts in every region of India, in all the different scripts of India, you come to have different regional recensions, so that, as scholars call them, of this great text. So they're not the same. So the purpose of a critical edition, and it's a very difficult one, as you know from the Mahabharata critical edition that you work on, the idea is to try to comparatively read these different manuscripts from different recensions, the North and the South, the Northeast and the South, the Northwest, the Gujarati versions, the Kashmiri versions, the Tamil versions, the Malayalam versions, all in different scripts, which makes it even more difficult because they're not necessarily readable by people who don't know those scripts. Leaves you with a complicated picture. So the idea is to compare these texts and see essentially, let me put it basically, what is there that is in, if not all of the manuscripts, in most of the manuscripts that have survived to the present day. And you get a critical edition, and then you're able to build an apparatus of how these different manuscripts are connected to one another historically. And it's a long and difficult process, and I must give the greatest credit to the scholars at the Ramayana department at the Sayajirao, Maharaja Sayajirao University of Baroda, for taking the effort to, over 26 years, to put together this critical edition. And that was the start of it. And I wanted that to make it something that would be available to readers around the world. And I didn't want to do it myself because it's a huge undertaking, as you see. And I had arguments with a much older colleague of mine who started the translation of the critical edition of the Mahabharata, which is a far greater text just in terms of sheer volume. I'd say 4 times the length of the Ramayana. And I thought that to do something like this justice, first of all, you need not to be arrogant about it. You need to read this text with people who have grown up with this text and have been trained in the text. So I spent years reading the text with Sanskrit scholars, Sanskrit pundits in India. And you need to read the original scholarship on the Ramayana, which is the Sanskrit language commentaries, of which there are dozens. And some are quite complicated and difficult. And they date from about the end of the first millennium, let's say, of the Common Era, up down into the 18th, 19th century. So it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. And you can see from the finished product, for example, the final book of our original translation is over 1,500 pages, of which 1,000 pages is just notes on the different readings, on the different translations we read, because we don't want to say ours is the definitive translation, because the other scholars have translated this text into dozens of languages, and we have to give them that respect as well. And every translation, as you know, I like to say it's a set of opinions, because you can't absolutely know, especially the text of that antiquity, exactly what the intention of the author was. So we set about this journey. I recruited a group of younger Sanskrit scholars. Each one I assigned one of the big books of the epic, the so-called Kandas, as they're called. There are 7. And we started that back in the 1970s. And over the course of time, the composition of this group tended to change. People dropped out because of disagreements as to what exactly we should do, whether we should translate it into verse, whether we should translate it into prose. And some people, unfortunately, died over the course of this adventure, and eventually narrowed down to a smaller number of people. And Sally, whom some of you saw earlier when we were setting up here, and I sort of took it over after a point and did the last. I did the first book, and then the two of us did the last 4 books of the epic, and there it is. So it was a great adventure, as you say, and it's ongoing, and it's also for if people are interested in it and don't want to spend thousands of dollars on this 7-volume monstrosity that some people have called it. It also exists in a single paperback volume that's not very expensive. So if people just want to read the translation and get a sense of what the text is about and why it's important, then that's available to people either online or in e-versions or whatever. There are also Indian versions of the translation. Motilal Banarsi Das did most of the books.
Professor Goldman, I would actually like to speak a bit more about your translation. So, your translation is widely considered the gold standard for the Valmiki Ramayana, in English at least, and scholars across the world refer to it as the definitive work. And yet, we know there were translations of the Ramayana even prior to this. So, what did you do differently that others hadn't, and why did you think that the text merited a new translation?
Well, as I mentioned, the first thing is that there was no translation of the critical edition because no one had taken that up. So all of the existing translations of the epic prior to this are based on one or another of those regional variations, either the southern recension, which many people have translated, or there is one translation of the northeastern translation, the Bengali so-called translation by the Italian scholar Gaspari Gorizia. We looked at that one as well. So in that sense, it is unique, I should say. However, there is a subsequent translation by Vivek Debroy, a multi-volume translation of the critical edition, which is not a scholarly tradition, as he acknowledged to me. But I knew him. Poor chap passed away not long ago. So that's one thing. In other words, there is no scholarly translation of the critical edition. That's one of the reasons people are particularly keen on using it, because it's a standard that all scholars around the world can use. Secondly, there are no other translations that we've come across that have the detailed annotation that we put into it in terms of the different readings, in terms of the interpretations of the text, in terms of the other translations of the text with which we sometimes agree and we sometimes disagreed. So it's kind of an encyclopedic look at translations of the translation of the Ramayana into English, into French, into German, into Italian, into other languages. And we also have provided very, very elaborate introductions to each individual Kanda, which also nobody has done. So we get into the characters, the narrative flow, into individual characters developed, the individual reaction between the characters. So it's a lot more elaborate treatment of it on a Kanda by Kanda basis than has ever been done. I appreciate your remarks about the gold standard. I must say, just as a footnote, not everybody likes our translation. People have been critical of it for various reasons. And that often is because it's different from the version they knew growing up, which is fine. But for example, a lot of people in India said, no, it's not as good as the Gita Press edition. We have no problem with the Gita Press edition. We read it. We used it in our translation. It's an excellent translation. But as I said, it's only a translation of one tradition of the Valmiki Ramayana. So if that's the one you like, fine, but it isn't the same as the one we're doing. Many of the things you find in many of the popular Ramayanas are not in our translation because they were cut out by the scholars of the critical edition at Baroda. Not our excision, but theirs. Although we sometimes restore some because we don't always agree with their cuts either. So there's no translation of that quite like ours.
Okay, that's great to hear. The next thing I want to ask is that you've been studying the Valmiki Ramayana for well over 30 years. So, in all these years of studying the Ramayana, what is something that you've learned about Rama that most people you think do not know or have never even heard of, perhaps?
Well, Rama is quite an extraordinary character, and he's served as a kind of cultural ideal and model for countless people across Southern Asia as a kind of exemplar of how a person should behave in this world. So one has to be impressed by the poet's characterization of a kind of idealized person in society, how to be a person in your society. And that means adhering very strictly to rules of what is right and what is wrong. So he becomes a kind of paragon of dharma. And so the Ramayana itself is, among other things we can talk about, is a Dharmashastra. It's a way of teaching you through example, largely, not so much preaching, but through example of how you should be in your family, in your political universe, in your country, in your society, and how you should not be. Now, of course, the norms of the Ramayana, that is Valmiki's Ramayana, belong to a very ancient society, because we believe this text dates from probably around the middle of the first millennium before the Common Era. So many of the social structures and class structures and familial structures and views on gender have changed over the course of multiple generations. What people may not know about Rama as the hero, I think, is the humanity of this figure. You know, modern versions and modern people talk about Rama often in his most martial form, you know, as the great warrior. I'm going, you know, as Tulsidas, says in his Ramayana, he vows to make the world Nishacharahin. He'll wipe out all the Nishacharas, that is the Rakshasas of the world. But Rama is very, and Sita too, is very humane in a way. For example, the first battle he has with Ravana, most people don't know this. People are familiar with the final battle. But early in the sixth book of the Ramayana, Rama and Ravana have their first battle. And Rama utterly defeats Ravana, who is exhausted. His bow is broken. His chariot is smashed. His horses are killed. His charioteer is dead. He's helpless. And he could easily be killed. And that would be it. That's the end of the Ramayana. But Rama says, no, I can see you're too exhausted to fight properly. And it wouldn't be fair for me to take your life now. So please go back and rest. And Ravana is humiliated, of course, but he does. Rama shoots his crown off. And that's the final straw. He goes back to the city dejected, and he recuperates. So people don't know those kind of things. Then again, in the heat of the battles, the major battles that take place, you know, there's a character in the Ramayana who's actually more dangerous than Ravana, which is Ravana's son. Some people call Indrajit. Valmiki just calls him Ravani, Ravana's son, because he's not only a great warrior, he's a sorcerer, and he can make himself invisible. And he fights from a flying chariot, which is invisible. And at one point in the epic, he has struck down all of Rama's army, Rama and Lakshmana as well. And they're about to lose. And Lakshmana, Rama's brother, says to him, brother, I'm going to use the deadly Brahma weapon, the Brahmastra, and that will exterminate all the Rakshasas in one fell swoop. And Rama says, no, you can't do that. That would be against the rules of chivalry. You can never, and then he quotes the Dharmashastra, you can never kill an enemy who's facing away from you, who's seeking mercy, who's not paying attention, who's engaged in a battle with someone else. So he's willing to essentially lose rather than break those laws. You compare that with your Mahabharata, where, you know, it's you win by any means necessary, no matter what it takes, you have to do it. This is Krishna's advice. Rama is very different in that way. And even Sita, you know, when Sita, who's suffered terribly from her abduction and the torment of the Rakshasa women, is finally informed by Hanuman that the war is over and Rama has come to take her back. Hanuman says to her, my lady, please give me permission to kill all these horrible Rakshasa women who have been tormenting you and making your life a hell. And she says, no, that is improper. They're only servants of Ramana. They didn't do this of their own accord. And I don't give you that permission because nobody is perfect, she says. Very interesting. There's nobody who's totally innocent. And so he has to leave them alone. He threatens to tear them apart and kill them. So there are many things like that. And finally, even when he kills the great villain, Ravana himself, the thorn in the side of the world, like the Loka Kantaka, he tells Vibhishana, that is Ravana's younger brother, now you please give him a good Vedic funeral. And Vibhishana says, no, I don't want to do that. He was a horrible scoundrel. He was a rapist. He was a murderer. He was the most terrible character possible. And he doesn't deserve a good funeral. And Rama kind of scolds him and says, no, he was a great warrior. He was your brother. And then he makes an obscure comment. He says, as he was to you, so he is to me. All hostilities end with death. Madanantani vairani. All hostilities end with death. Please do it. And then, of course, Vibhishana performs the sanskara for his brother. So these are the things that many people don't know, because if you haven't read the whole Ramayana, and it's a long text, you don't see these things. You know, you just see the things in the short versions. So it's worth the read.
So the Ramayana as a text has been read since centuries. But how do you think its reception as a text has evolved over time? And do you think it always commanded the same reverence that it does today? Or do you think there have been ebbs and flows over there as well?
One of the unique things about the Valmiki Ramayana is it provides you with a discussion of its own reception. In other words, because it's framed around the first creation and first performance. Because this is not just a literary text that you read, it's a performative text. It's actually a musical text. This makes it very clear in the beginning. The verses that Valmiki composes are said in the text to be tantri laya samanvitam, suitable for accompaniment by stringed and percussion instruments. And the first performances of it are by these twin sons of Rama, of whom he does not know, Love and Kusha. And Valmiki sends them out into the world, and they perform this text. And the audiences are represented as being absolutely ravished by this. And the people who listen to it, they say, "What beautiful singing! What fabulous music!" The story is recited so that it seems to be that those events that took place so long ago are actually happening before our very eyes. So the text actually has its own discussion of its own reception. And it's interesting the way this text is structured, because those performances of the Ramayana, the early performances, culminate in a performance in front of Rama himself. Because these itinerant bards, so to speak, the boys, take this show and at the highways and byways, the villages and the cities, and they come to the capital and they sing this song before Rama himself. And that's, in a sense, the beginning of the actual narrative of the Ramayana. But it's also the end. Because if you go all the way to the end of the Ramayana, it ends at that same point where those two boys are reciting that story to their father. So we don't know. It's I mentioned a little bit earlier, what has kept this text alive is several things, one of which is it's a deeply religious text. So the reception of that is read as it's a pious thing to read it. It has, just like other texts, like the Gita and the Puranas, it has what you call these palashrutis. If you read this text, if you hear this text, if you hear only part of it, if you hear one verse of it, you are transformed to heaven. If you're a Brahmin, you become learned. If you're a Kshatriya, you become a great king or warrior. In other words, so the text itself has a powerful effect on people just by hearing it or reading it, because it's a deeply religious text, because Rama is, after all, an avatara of Lord Vishnu Narayana, but it's the only version of the Ramayana, at least in Hindu India, and I want to just restrict that because there are many other versions, in which the unique feature is that Rama is not supposed to know that he's an avatara of Vishnu, because that's a condition set by Lord Brahma for Ravana, that he cannot be killed by gods or other supernatural beings. So the Lord has to take form as a human. And he's obviously not an ordinary human, you can tell. But he doesn't seem to be aware of himself as a divinity in the same way, say, that Lord Krishna does. So in the end of near the end of the epic, in the sixth book, I should say, when he's finally carried out the mission of the gods, which is killing Ravana, all the gods descend to earth and they celebrate him as the great Lord who he really is, Narayana. And Rama's reaction is, really? I always thought of myself just as this guy, this Rama, the son of Dasharatha, right? Atmanam, right? Atmanam manye manusham, Ramam Dasharatatmajam. I've always thought of myself, Atmanam, as manusham, as a man named Rama, the son of King Dasharatha. So that's a unique feature of Valmiki's version of the Ramayana. Later versions don't actually have that. If you compare it with, say, later texts like the Adhyatma Ramayana, it's quite a different feeling, because Rama always knows exactly what's going to happen and is, entirely in charge of what's going on in the epic. It's not so in Valmiki. So that also gives a different feel to the attempt, because Rama in Valmiki is made to suffer like an ordinary person. And that may be part of the sort of pastoral, if you like, function of that text. That it's one thing to say, Krishna did this and Krishna did that, but you can't be like Krishna. You can't do all these fabulous feats and so on and be invulnerable to everybody and everything. Rama suffers. He suffers emotionally from the loss of Sita. He suffers physically from being wounded and so on. But then the teaching that you should be like Rama makes more sense, because he's someone you could try to be like, at least, because he presents those vulnerabilities that we as human beings have. So that's another feature, I think, that's of some concern. The other thing is, it's also a poem. It's the poem. It's the first poem. So it sets the model. It's a beautiful poem. It's filled with marvelous similes and metaphors and beautiful descriptions of forests and mountains and valleys and fabulous, fabulous descriptions. So it works on a number of levels that not every version does. And it's also, as I said, it's a Dharmashastra. So it has this triple function, in a way, that it's a religious text. It's a devotional text in which Rama is revealed at moments as an object of devotion, as a person, a source of refuge. So like Hanuman and Vibhishana become his great bhaktas, and are revered also for that, because they are, even Tulsidas says this, More man Prabhu asa visvasa ramte adhika ram karatasa. I have this faith that even greater than Ram is Ram's dasa. It means Hanuman. So why? Because he's the dasa, because he's the servant of Ram. So, those are features of it. But also it's a very strict kind of, Rama obeys his father's unwilling command without any hesitation. Even when his brother is Lakshmana is filled with anger, he says, no, that's father's word, and a son must obey his father, just as a wife must follow and obey her husband, and so on. There's a very integral social structure that is centered in the royal family of Ayodhya. If you want to see dysfunctional families, the poet moves you out to the monkey kingdom of Kishkinda, where there's this fierce rivalry between the two monkey kings and his brother, winding up with the killing of the elder. And you can move into the totally dissolute realm of the Rakshasas of Lanka, which again winds up with a fratricidal conflict between Vibhishana and Ravana, and Vibhishana finally gets Ravana killed by aiding Rama. So the poet has separated out these different realms in ways to look at different aspects of the human condition without lessening the import of a kind of idealized world of Ayodhya.
So I'd like to talk a bit now about the authorship of the Ramayana. So we know that the Ramayana is called the Adi Kavya. Valmiki is hailed as the Adi Kavi. The story of actually why he wrote the Ramayana and whether he was chosen to write it is actually equally fascinating. So don't you think Indian scriptures are somewhat unique in this manner, where even the relationship between the author and his or her text is very different from, let's say, texts elsewhere, because the author is sometimes also involved as a character in the text. So how do you see the relationship between the author and the text in the Valmiki Ramayana?
Well, I think you raise a very good point. In many of the parallel texts from other cultures, the author does not appear at all. It just starts off, with the words presumably of the author. If you look at the Iliad, it's Menina Edetea, sing goddess, the anger of Peleus' son Achilles, and then tell the story. More or less the same with the Aeneid and so on and so forth, or many parallel texts. But the unique thing I think about the Indian epics is that the authors are characters in the epic. It's particularly pronounced in the Mahabharata, where Vyasa is a character of some consequence throughout the epic. Valmiki appears at the beginning and at the end, essentially, with one sort of cameo appearance in the late part of the text. So I think that is different, because it's an offering that this is something that comes out of a person, and the Ramayana is framed as a poem, right? We learn more about the composition of it than we do even the Mahabharata, and that story is very interesting because you have this little pre-story. Let's put it this way: Valmiki didn't write the story of Rama, correct? He hears that story, apparently for the first time, from a visiting sage, Narada. So the opening chapter of the Ramayana is a very short and very almost intentionally non-poetic account of the career of Rama. Very brief. The whole story is told in about 79 shlokas, you see? And then, having learned that story, Valmiki goes out into the woods to have his morning dip in the Tamasa River. And in doing so, he suddenly gets a renewed appreciation for the beauty of nature. And he comes upon a pair of cranes, these Sarasa cranes, mating. And he's just fascinated with this. And as he watches, a hunter comes out of the forest and shoots and kills the male. And the female wails piteously. And Valmiki, is suddenly struck with how wrong this was. As he says, adharmoyam, this is not dharma. Not adharma because it isn't wrong for a hunter to kill an animal in that world. It's wrong because the animal is distracted in the pleasures of love, you could say, right, as he calls it. And he sees the grief, the mourning of the surviving bird, the female, and he spontaneously curses the hunter. Now, as you know, the curse is a very popular motif in Indian literature. It drives the plots of almost every story. And but in this, it comes out in a musical form, as he says. So he says, "Manishada pratishtantam magamashashvati samaha yat kronchap midunadekam avadi kama mohitam." You should die, essentially. He says to this hunter, because you killed one of these birds while they were kama mohitam, that is, they were entranced by the act of love. And then he says, "What is this I said? How did it come out in such a metrical and musical form in the and he goes back to his ashram pondering that, and there he meets a guest who's the great creator divinity Brahma. And Brahma says to him, "Don't be perplexed about this. This was my doing. I inspired you because of your sensitivity, your compassion for this bird, the grief you felt for this bird." And the word is Shloka, right? So because you cursed this person out of Shloka, that verse should be called Shloka. It's like a play on sound that they're very fond of, the ancient Indian authors. And he said, "Now I have a job for you. I commission you to write a beautiful, musical, poetic tale of that very brief story you heard this morning from Sage Narada. And I will give you a kind of divine gift of vision. So you'll be able to see everything that happened in the lives of all these figures, Rama and Sita and Lakshmana and Hanuman, everybody." So he was inspired. This is an inspiration from the creator divinity to create poetry, shloka, which they're using as a generic term for poetry. And so he then sat down and composed the great Adi Kavya, the great Adi poem, the original poem, which is supposed to be the model for all subsequent poets. And many later poets pay homage to Valmiki, either as the great poet, even the Buddhist poets like Ashvaghosha, Valmiki Radha Uchasasaraja Padyam. In the beginning, he says, in this Buddha Charita, it was Valmiki in beginning who created verse. So that is beautiful verse. So it has that important, unique value of being the origin of beautiful use of language. And then he then does that and teaches it to his disciples, and the disciples then take it out and perform it in the world. And from that, we have it with us to this very day, because it's been alive for countless generations of people to this very day, both in its own form and in all the different subsequent Ramayanas that have been written by the poets and saints of all over India, by the Jains, by the Buddhists, by the Indonesians, by the Thais, the Buddhist Thais. Everyone in that culture is fascinated with this story. The Thai kings just named themselves Rama, 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 Rama 1, Rama 2, Rama 3. They called their capital city Ayutthaya, which is just their pronunciation of Ayodhya. So this has become a pan-Asian production, a massive production. There's very few things like it in the world, in world history. So yeah, it is different because the authors themselves are so much a part of their own story. And as I said, I believe this is the first iteration of the Rama story in text. I mean, people have argued that the Ramapakyana in the Mahabharata is the first version, and there's even these legends that the real first poet of the Ramayana was Hanuman, who is said to have written the entire Ramayana on a cliff face in gold letters. But when he came to see Valmiki's epic, he said, if Valmiki comes to see my much superior Ramayana, he'll be very depressed. So Hanuman graciously erased his own. That's actually a fun folk story. That's kind of cute.
So, Professor Goldman, you were earlier talking about how Ram's vulnerability and perhaps his humanity makes him a more relatable figure as compared to, let's say, someone like Krishna. So, could you perhaps talk about one or two incidents that particularly and starkly highlight this vulnerability of Rama?
Yes, it's a very interesting question. One of the things that Rama is highly revered for, first of all, is his very perfect composure under various kinds of stressful situations. So he's often very much honored for the fact that when on the eve of his consecration, the king of what is represented as a vast, powerful, and wealthy kingdom, when he learns from his stepmother that he's to be exiled and banished as a pauper the next day to a life of penury in the forest, his reaction is really no reaction. He just says, okay, because he's willing, if it's his father's will, and it wasn't, but the father was manipulated by the woman, right? And he says, he says to Kaikeyi, he says, why did you put my father through such torment by making him do this? If you had just said to me, Rama, go into exile, I would have done it because you're my mother, just like my older mother, and so on and so forth. So he has gained that reputation. On the other hand, on certain occasions, he suffers greatly. And those mostly have to do with Sita. he puts up with all kinds of problems in the forest. Rakshasas attack them. All kinds of terrible things happen. But when Sita is abducted, and you get a little foreshadowing of this in the very first, a lot of people don't know this too, the very opening of the third book of the epic, before Ravana comes on the scene, Sita is temporarily abducted by this monstrous forest Rakshasa named Virada. And Rama becomes very desolate. He almost becomes unable to do anything. And then Lakshmana has to say to him, Rama, get it together. We must fight them. So they do. They fight and they kill this guy. And then, of course, it turns out that this was Rakshasa was really a yaksha or a divinity who was cursed by his master for some dereliction, and it's a liberation by Rama of this wretched figure. He turns into a heavenly being. You see several instances of that in the Ramayana. When Sita is actually stolen by Ravana, Rama becomes violently agitated in the middle of the third book, and he becomes very, very, very wild and distraught, and he threatens to actually destroy the world. He says, to the forest, to the animals, to the forest, give me back Sita, or I will kill you all, I'll burn it all down. And then Lakshmana, who plays a kind of opposite to Rama, when Rama's upset, it's Lakshmana who calms him. When Lakshmana is upset, it's Rama who calms him. So they kind of play off each other's character, which was a very brilliant technique that Valmiki used with these brothers. And then, as I said, he suffers, absent from Sita, very, very mournful. Some of the very beautiful passages of the text, he's before they cross to Lanka, he sits and he, laments, where what torments me is that I was not there when my beloved cried out for help. And he says, blow wind where my beloved is, and for on you depends the meaning of our touch. And he says to the moon, moon shine on her and me, for on you depends the meaning of our glances. So he suffers a lot emotionally in the absence of Sita because of the importance of that. And as I said, he suffers because he's not immune to all. This is Valmiki's Rama. He's not immune to all kinds of problems. As you know, for example, when in the Mahabharata, when Krishna goes as an emissary to the court of Duryodhana, to try to negotiate this elusive peace settlement, right? And Duryodhana has this mad scheme to capture Krishna. This is a huge mistake, because then Krishna turns into this terrifying figure with all the gods and flames shooting out of his body and something, and they're all terrified of him. Rama doesn't do things like that. Rama then allows himself to be wounded. And the commentators go on, is he really bleeding? They talk all about the blood flowing. Is he really bleeding? Or is he only doing this to show people that they can be stoic like him in adversity? There's a whole kind of ethical discourse around Rama's suffering. As you know, I've written articles on this, how the poet manages this. Is this just to teach people, and so on and so forth? Or does he really not know that he's divine? Or because that would violate Brahma's sort of boon that he gave to Ravana. So he comes across as a very, very superior human being, and he can do things that other human beings cannot do. He kills 14,000 Rakshasas in one small battle. He terrorized the ocean god into calming the waves so they can build a bridge over the ocean by threatening to shoot the ocean. And he also has that salvific characteristic of a divinity. First thing you learn is he in the first book is he frees Ahalya from her long curse. She had been cursed by her husband to be invisible and live on no food or water for long periods of time. And when Rama approaches her, she regains her natural state, and her husband comes and forgives her. And then he frees these Rakshasas, several of the Rakshasas that he killed, from the curse that made them Rakshasas, and so on. So he has this quality of being a divinity. But when he suffers from the absence of Sita, then he gets very, very agitated. And one of the final scenes of the epic, as you recall, Sita re-enters the earth to the end of the final book of the Ramayana, and Rama becomes very agitated, and he threatens, that if the earth doesn't give him back, he'll destroy it, and so on and so forth. So the poet wants to show that he has human emotions, although he's not an ordinary human. So it's a delicate but fascinating balance that the poet manages to create such an extraordinary character in this extraordinary poem.
Okay. So I would like to move on to our next segment now, where we will take questions from our own that have been sent in from members of our own community and from people who are generally curious about Valmiki or the Ramayana in general. And we've picked a few questions at random, and I would love to hear your thoughts about these. So I know we
Sure.
know that
Yeah.
Rama was sent into exile by his own father Dasharatha, but why 14 years specifically? Like, what's the symbolic or numerological significance behind that number?
That's a very good question for whoever asked it. It's a very difficult one to answer. Um, if you look at the Mahabharata, this the number 18, which is very prominently featured in the epic. There are 18 books of the epic. There are 18 armies. The battle lasts 18 days. And 18 is a very potent numerological number in Indian numerological theory. 14, not so much. I haven't ever been able to find anything looking at numerological text that has anything negative to say about 14. I know that Valmiki likes the number 14 because not only is he sent out for 14 years, right, but there are several instances where the number recurs. For example, when he's living in the forest and he has that encounter with Shurpanaka, the sister of Ravana, right? So she goes back and complains to the Rakshasas who are living there in the Dandaka. And 14 Rakshasas come to avenge their sister and attack Rama. Rama kills all 14 of them. One of them survives and goes back and says, this guy is very tough. We need a bigger army. So they send 14,000 Rakshasas now to avenge Shurpanaka. And Rama kills the 14,000 Rakshasas. Why the 14? I really don't know the exact answer to that. Only one thing, it's another, the way he likes to refer to 14. He only calls it 14 sometimes. Otherwise, he calls it 9 and 5. You'll be banished to the forest for 9 years and 5. He likes that juxtaposition of number of the poet. But remember, who came up with the number 14 for the exile of Rama? It wasn't his father, Dasharatha. It wasn't Kaikeyi either. It was Mantara. Mantara is this hunchback nurse of Kaikeyi who starts the whole problem of the exile, right? Because she's eager that her mistress, Kaikeyi, be the queen mother of her son, Bharata. And she says, you must tell the king, that is Dasharatha, that he must send Rama into the exile in the forest for 9 years and 5, for 14 years. Why she picked that number? We don't know, except that she says she figures that would be, as she puts it, time enough for Bharata to establish deep roots in the kingdom. And he and his supporters will strike deep roots in the kingdom and win over the populace. And they consecrate Bharata on the 14th day, and they list the 14 errors of kings, the 14 virtues of Hanuman. So the number keeps repeating throughout the epic. But the duration of the epic was a political choice by the canny Mantara. She figured that would be just long enough for Bharata to wipe out any local support for Rama and establish himself fully as the king, so that when Rama came back, he would not be able to recapture the throne, supposedly, in her estimation. Uh, but I don't know an exact reason for that. It's you have to ask Mantara.
Okay, maybe we'll be able to do that sometime. Okay, so you briefly touched upon some of the other recensions of the Ramayana, right? But what are some of the other references to Rama in other texts, whether it be Kavya or post-Puranic texts or other post-classical texts that you know of?
Well, yes, there are so many. There are so many. First of all, Rama becomes a model and a figure in many later texts. For example, if you look at the Kalidasa's Raghuvamsha, one of the great Mahakavyas, it's about the whole history of Rama's lineage, but it focuses most of its time on the Ramayana story. And then you have the great plays of the 8th century poet playwright Bhavabhuti, right? His Uttara Ramacharita and his Mahavira Charita, and even the early playwright Bhasa has a number of plays featuring the Rama and the Rama story, like the Pratimanataka, and so on. But these poets often change a little bit the character of Rama. If you look at, and I've written about this also, if you look at Bhavabhuti's construction of Rama, Rama is someone who kind of, one of the central elements of the Ramayana, which in the final book of the epic, which a lot of people don't like, partially for this reason, is that when Rama has won the war, brought Sita back, he sends her away. He banishes her. And she winds up being sheltered in the ashram of Valmiki, where she gives birth to her twin sons, who will then come back and be the heirs of Rama. But a lot of the poets find that disturbing, the banishing of Rama. Even Rama in Valmiki finds this disturbing, and some of the characters find it odd and disturbing. But in Bhavabhuti, Rama becomes his own critic. Why am I doing this? He talks to his hand. Look at this hand that sent my beloved into exile, and so on and so forth. And there are other instances in the Rama that sit uneasily with later poets. One of this, also in the 7th book, is this killing of the shrewd ascetic, Shambhuka, right? Shambhuka, he kills because Shambhuka is violating dharma. He's practicing kind of asceticism, which he's not supposed to be available to that class at that time. This is what, how that text is constructed. Later poets are not exactly happy with that. And what do they do with it? Much later texts, of course, go to work around it or glorify Shambhuka. That's another story. But Bhavabhuti turns Shambhuka into a divine figure who, once he's killed, comes back on stage as a divine personage and recites some of the most beautiful poetry in the second act of the Ramayana, which is something strange. Even Kalidasa says that since Rama killed Shambhuka, he attained a higher heaven than he would have even through performing those ascetic acts that he was doing, and so on and so forth. And of course, in modernity, a lot of critiques on that by different caste groups and so on and so forth. That's another matter. If you look, of course, for the later texts, such as the Adhyatma Ramayana and Tulsidas Ramayana, and so many of the Hindu Ramayanas, Rama is very clearly God. He's the incarnation of God, of the Supreme Lord Vishnu. He knows it, everybody knows it, and they worship him. So the Rakshasas are trying to get themselves killed by Rama. Even in some late interpolations to Valmiki, not by Valmiki, but later texts, Ravana spends centuries trying to get himself killed by Rama so he can be liberated. But Rama keeps saying, Vishnu keeps saying, no, not yet, not yet. You have to do it at a certain time, and then eventually this will work out. Adhyatma Ramayana, as I mentioned, Tulsidas, it's very clear that Rama is God, and there's no two ways about it. He knows he's God. Everybody knows he's God. Fine. What about the other religious traditions of India that also are fascinated with the Rama story and have their own Ramayanas? So, but they don't believe in Avatara. So if you look at the Buddhist literature, starting with the Jataka tales, like the Dasaratha Jataka, Rama's a pre-incarnation of the Buddha for them. In other words, he will eventually be reborn, like all those other pre-incarnations that are mentioned in the Jataka tales, as the Buddha, a Buddha, I should say, right? The Jains don't believe in avatars either. So for the Jains, there are these different groups, 63 remarkable men who are born in every half cycle of time, according to the Jain cosmology. And those are called the Trishashti Shalaka Purushas, the 63 outstanding men. And there are so many Chakravartins and so many kings and so all that kind of thing. But in every cycle, there are 3 figures who are bound together in a way. 2 of them are brothers, and one of them is the enemy of the brothers, right? So Rama and Lakshmana are 2 of those figures in that cycle of the world, and Ravana is their enemy. But because Rama is the elder and the one who's going eventually to become a Jinnah, right? In those versions, Rama does not kill Ravana, Lakshmana does, because the insistence of the Jain text on ahimsa, and Rama cannot be tainted by the killing of anyone, even a horrible enemy. In the next cycle, it's Krishna, Balarama, and Jarasandha, right? So these people are called, respectively, the Vasudeva, the Baladeva, and the Prativasudeva, regardless of what their actual names are. Those are the positions they hold in the Jain Ramayanas, of which there are several. So there's that. And then when Ramayana stories migrate to Southeast Asia, if they go to the Buddhist countries, then Rama becomes a kind of bodhisattva, a pre-incarnation of the Buddha. In the Islamic countries, Rama, like in Indonesia, this Hikayat Seri Rama, or if you look at the wayang shadow puppet plays that are mainly focused on in Mahabharata, then Rama is an idealized prince, but not an avatara, obviously. So, or even the the Indian Sufi poet Muhammad Jayasi had written a Sufi poem about Krishna's life called the Kanhavata. This is like a 12th century poem in Awadhi. And in that poem, you have the supreme God, which he calls Parameswar, is concerned because there's this demonic figure, Kamsa. And he tells Vishnu, you should go down to earth and deal with this guy, this Kamsa. He's a terrible demonic force. And Krishna says to him, I don't want to do that because my last birth, I had all kinds of problems. I lost my kingdom. I lost my wife. I had all kinds of problems. And I really don't feel like doing that again. And then the Lord says to him, all right, here, this time you'll have a life as Krishna. And, the sages will bow at your feet and so on. So it's the story of Rama, the character of Rama has just appealed so widely to people, from Afghanistan in the west to Bali in the east, and into Tibet and Mongolia. There are versions of the story everywhere in Southern Asia, and even some people say that the great Chinese novel, the Shioji, or the monkey, is based on Hanuman's adventures. So it's an extraordinary thing, and it all goes back to Valmiki in the end, I believe.
It's fascinating to hear about the sort of wide reception and influence of the Ramayana. I want to talk about something very specific that's come in, and that's also fascinated me. At one particular juncture in the Ramayana, Sugriva gives a very detailed description of the geography of the known world and of lands far and wide away from Ayodhya and sort of central North India. So how did Sugriva at that time have such knowledge of lands and geographies away from North India? And do you think this is Sugriva's own knowledge, or is this Valmiki's knowledge being put into the mouth of Sugriva?
Well, I think it must be Valmiki's knowledge which he's putting, because he's writing the script for all of his characters, right? I mean, granted, even if you take literally Brahma's promise that you'll see exactly what everybody did in every moment through this divya drishti, this grant of divine vision, he's still writing the text as a poem. I mean, even if he's recording accurately all these conversations, and after all, the Ramayana is one big set of conversations. It's just people talking back and forth to each other, right? Starting with Valmiki. Then we're not going to believe that the people in ancient India spoke in shlokas in their everyday lives, because that doesn't seem to be a probable kind of thing. So already he's doing this with this knowledge. Well, first of all, they do have reason. He does have reasonable knowledge of a kind of circle of territory around the heartland of the Ramayana story, which would be, Ayodhya, which would be in UP, Faizabad district today. And he sends the party of monkeys out in the 4 directions. And he gives them these very, very elaborate descriptions of what they'll see there. But the accuracy of those descriptions only go so far, right? All of them end in mythical places, or the ends of the earth, or in places where the sun does not shine and no human can go there. And you'll go to the north, you'll go to the Himalayas, you'll go to the Uttara Kurus, but beyond that, no human or monkey or anyone can travel. In other words, it's as though there's this circle, as you say. And how did Sugriva, let's put it this way, how did Sugriva get this knowledge? Did he study geography in monkey heights? I don't think so. No, he describes it. It goes back to this family dysfunction problem with the monkeys. When he got on the bad side of his brother Valin for essentially usurping his kingdom and taking his wife, his brother drove him out of the kingdom and pursued him. And they were both these all flying monkeys. So he pursued him all around the world. And he describes it, I was flying at such an altitude that the whole round earth looked like her. And I could see all these places. Again, it's within the known territory of, I'd say, a person of some education in the time of Valmiki. The people traveled, there was trade, there was, caravans. The Ayodhya is represented as a cosmopolitan kingdom with tributaries extending to the north, south, east, and west. So they knew those territories to the east and to the west, out to the limits of the northwest, the northeast, the Himalaya, and the Vindhyas and beyond. But beyond that, essentially the Indian subcontinent, not so much knowledge of things the northern boundaries of the Himalayas, not so much knowledge of what's beyond the seas. They do refer to some islands in the seas, but there's a limit to which they say you cannot travel, and that's where there are giant birds who prey on elephants and carry them up into trees, and there are one-eyed monsters and all kinds of imagined things, such as you find if you look at ancient Greek historians like Herodotus. When his knowledge goes out to what he's heard about India, his knowledge starts to get very strange. There are giant ants who dig up, according to Herodotus, who dig up gold into great mounds, but they're as large as horses, and they chase you down, and so on and so forth. So obviously, these are travelers' tales, fantasy tales, imagined tales that are beyond actual geographic knowledge that they would have obtained at that time, but they weren't restricted to tiny spaces. The Bharata travels all the way up into the Punjab when he's out of town during the second book of the epic. He goes away to visit his relatives in Rajgriha, which is up in they know the Gandhara. In the last book, they make war on the Gandharvas of Gandhara. It's slightly mythic. They do know of these places, and they know the rivers, they know the mountain ranges. I mean, they're not totally parochial.
Okay, so Professor Goldman, now we'll move on to our third segment, and I would ask you a few questions, and I would request you to give answers to these, if possible, in 1 or 2 lines, in under 30 seconds, if possible. So my first question is: if today you had to describe the Valmiki Ramayana to your grandson, let's say, or a 5-year-old, how would you do that?
Well, I have done that. Exactly that. You tell him the main story. There's a famous verse from the Krishna Karnamrita of Lila Shuka, right? Which is just this. It's a lovely verse. I can recite it for you if you like. It's kind of a great verse. It says, this is Yashoda, Krishna's stepmother, is telling him a story to put him to sleep, a bedtime story. So what would she tell him? She tells him the Ramayana, right? So the verse goes like this: Ramo nama babuva hum. Hum means he's kind of yawning. The baby's falling asleep. Ramo nama babuva hum. There was a king named Rama. Tadabalasiteti hum, and his wife was named Sita. By his order of his father, they lived in the Panchavati forest, and Ravana stole her away. Now it says, may the words of Hari, who was listening to this Nidrartam Jananikata, his mother's tale, to put him to sleep, with these yawning sounds, while he's hearing it, he suddenly cries out, half asleep, Saumitre quad danur danuriti vyagragira pantuva. Lakshmana, where's my bow? Where's my bow? This is Krishna. Where's my bow? Where's my bow? Where's my bow? May those confused words of Hari protect you. So you can see there was a tradition that this was how people put kids to sleep. Traditionally, this is like the 13th century poem from Lila Shuka's collection. So yes, it's considered the ideal story to tell children. I mean, you can check out some of the very violent parts, which might be scary. Some of the parts that you thought it might not be suitable. But this is why my friends always said, tell your kids the Ramayana, not the Mahabharata. And the saying for raising a child was Ramadiva Nirattatvam, Naturavanadiva. You should behave like Rama, not like Ravana. So it's a teaching text. So why wouldn't you start as young as possible? Because that's when you imbibe these values from your parents. So yes, tell your grandchildren the Ramayana.
That's some good advice to take from the podcast. One thing I would say, for someone who doesn't have the time or maybe the capacity or the wherewithal to read the entire text, what would be the one chapter, if he or she just has time to read one chapter, which would be that one chapter of the Ramayana that you would recommend, and why?
That's very difficult. I guess probably the best chapter would be the chapter in the Ayodhya Kanda where the whole exile of Rama is described. Early on, around the 10th, 14th chapters of the second book, where you see the Karadama, because here is somebody who has everything: wealth, power. He's about to become this imperial figure, and he throws it away as if it were nothing, just because his father, not that his father wanted him to, his father is kind of forced to, and it kills him. It kills his father, that he has to part from his son. But because his scheming maidservant of his mother comes up with this plot, he says, no problem. And that's not just an act, because at the very end, once he's completed his 14 years of exile with hardship and suffering and warfare, and they come back, and he's about to re-enter his kingdom and be consecrated king. He doesn't enter the kingdom. He stops outside, and he sends Hanuman ahead. And he says to Hanuman, go and tell my brother Bharata that I've come back from my exile and I'm ready to reassume the throne of Ayodhya. And watch his face very closely. And if my brother shows, even by a twitch of an eyebrow or a facial expression, that he's disturbed at being displaced, tell me, and I'll go back into the forest forever. So this is a person who is the greatest king of the Indian tradition, but doesn't value it more than anything else other than righteousness. So this makes a great impression on people. It certainly has on me. And one can try to emulate a figure like that, I guess, but it's not easy.
Okay. Now I want to ask you, and we're coming to the close of our conversation, but if Valmiki were alive today and you could ask him one question, what would it be?
Well, I'd be tempted to ask him about the secret of his longevity, frankly. But aside from that, what do you think? I thought I would ask him, oh, now, what do you think of the many different readings of your magnum opus that have occurred since you composed the original Ramayana? What do you think they have honored your novel or departed from it or enriched it or made it appropriate for different eras that you have lived through? He's not one of the old Chirajivans. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that you're right and he was alive today. I would say, the world has changed so much in the last few thousand years. Would you still Ramayana the way you did back then?
Okay, so my last question, what is your favorite shloka from the Valmiki Ramayana? And if you could perhaps recite it and give your translation as well, that would be great for our audience.
That's, again, a very difficult question. The one that sticks in my mind, I mean, many of them do, is there's a point in the Sundara where this negative trajectory of the story comes to a very low point. And this is when Rama has, of course, been exiled. He's lost his kingdom. He's lost his wife. Sita has been carried off and subjected to all manner of abuse and so on. And she actually considers taking her own life. She's in such a miserable situation, plagued by Rakshas and so on. And Hanuman appears and speaks to her. First, she's very wary of him because she thinks it may be Ravana taking on a different form. He has to think, how should I address her? Talk to him. If I talk like a Brahmin, she'll think I'm Ravana. And, he's trying to adjust his register of speech. But in order to prove that he's genuine, he shows her the ring, the signet ring that Rama had entrusted to him as a token of recognition, right? And this is, I think, the moment when the whole trajectory turns and becomes into a positive trajectory. And the poet describes it as follows. Grihitva prekshamanasa partu karavibhushitam partarameva samprapta janaki mudita bhavata. That is to say, about the ring, she took it and she closely examined it, prekshamana, that ring belonging to her husband. And when she had done so, Janaki, that is Sita, became as happy as if she had gotten her husband back again. So for me, that's just a wonderful moment in the epic, and the kind of, in a sense, a critical point, from which point, you get the whole then other part of the story, the leap to the army coming to Lanka, the war, and the return to Sita and the coronation of Rama, although it doesn't quite end there. But anyway, that's my feeling. There are many wonderful verses in the Ramayana, but that one somehow sticks in my mind.
Okay, I think this is a great point to end the conversation. Thank you, Professor Goldman, for joining us here at Mythik and for this absolutely riveting conversation. I'm sure everyone really enjoyed it, and we look forward to having you with us and chatting with you again.
Well, thank you so much, Ishan. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, and I thank all of the people at Mythik who have made this possible. And I hope you'll have learned something more about the Ramayana from this.